Okay, so today, this talk I've never really given a talk like this because I was instructed don't talk about science, and that's usually all a scientist ever talks about. It'll be a little bit different. So let me go to the first slide. This is the charge, and if the first 15 or so minutes of this talk you don't like, blame Jacinda and Morgan, because this is from one of their emails. Share your experience in balancing funding, academia, and science, communication, education work. A pretty broad charge. How did you get to be in your position? So here's the plan. I'm going to give you my educational journey, and I'm going to point out that serendipity ruled it, and I think it rules many people's lives. I'm going to talk about my mentor journey, which is key, not me mentoring, but me being mentored, which is key to anyone's career, and it was extremely important to me. And actually, it's a fundamental part of Frontiers for Young Minds because the postdocs and the grad students who are mentoring the kids really, it's a great experience for both of them. And then my academic journey, which basically the bottom line is you got to be persistent in this world, and then I'll switch into real detailed stuff about Frontiers for Young Minds. So first, where am I from? Lawrence Harbor, New Jersey, little town. That's our house, 500 square feet next to a giant marsh. We loved the marsh. We had a great time. We were always outdoors. Um, My mother, when we'd finish eating, she'd say, "Get out of the house." Someone asked her when we were in our 40s, like at a big party with relatives, they said, "Jean, why did you tell your boys to get out of the house?" And she said they were very annoying. So that's the start of my life. And it's very famous. It should be, but it's not, for one thing. Of course, everybody knows that. It's the song from Jaws, which everybody thinks Jaws occurred in Long Island, a very fancy place with people wearing white outfits on the beach. But it's not true. That's my brother. That's the beach in Lawrence Harbor. That's actually where the great white was caught, right there in New Jersey. And it had a very interesting career, the shark. It had its first kill in Ocean City. This is a great book on the true story of the great white. Killed someone in the surf, killed someone else in the surf, went up here, took a left, went up this creek right here, which was brackish because it had fresh and salt water. People had thought maybe it's a bull shark. It was a great white. Killed two more kids. And most importantly, that's where the last two kills were. And that's Lawrence Harbor. So that's us right here, basically. So we grew up pretty rural, which was very, very nice for us. When I applied to college, if you don't have a lot of financial resources, you don't apply to a lot of places. I applied to 3, and I ended up going to Illinois Institute of Technology as a physics major and a math minor. And I wanted to go into astrophysics, and here's the first serendipity. I approached my favorite professor in physics, and I told her my tale of woe. I'd been working in Argonne Labs, and I saw postdocs lined up from here to forever without jobs. And I said, "Look, I'm on my own dime. What should I do?" She said, "Oh, you're a smart kid. Why don't you go to med school?" I said, "Med school? What's that? Is it like being a dentist?" Anyway, I applied to med school, and I got in to Northwestern. So here I am in med school at Northwestern, which was really great. And another kind of, I wouldn't call serendipity, but Northwestern was advanced. Its senior year, it let you take electives. And I chose to take electives in neurology, endocrinology, and immunology. And I met a great clinician in neurology, and I just got fascinated by being able to take a history, do an exam, and come up with a diagnosis and maybe do something to help the person. So, by the way, when I became an intern, I had to wear a ponytail because you try to examine comatose patients. It's not good if you have long hair. So, mentors, very, very critical. After med school, basically, I went into neurology, did my neurology residency at UC San Diego, and I had 3 amazing mentors. The first was Steve Hilliard. Some of you may not know him, but Steve was a pioneer, really, in using electrophysiology to define the neural mechanisms of attention, perception, cognition, a real giant. He was incredibly nice. He took me into his lab even though I didn't know squat. They would have these lab meetings with really talented postdocs, Marta Kudas and Helen Neville, and really sharp people, and I asked them, "What do I need to do?" And they gave me a book by Capel, Design and Analysis. They said, "Read this." So that was my introduction. But they were supportive, and Steve, I think, let me do whatever I want in terms of research. And since as a neurologist, I'd been fascinated by people with frontal lobe damage and how they just had a complete, real, if it was bilateral, profound loss of integrated, behavior. I decided to focus on the frontal lobe, and I started a series of experiments as a resident, and then I went to do a postdoc, now a faculty member, the great Helen Neville at the Salk Institute. She did amazing stuff, probably some of the most important human initial plasticity research, showing that if you were born blind, basically you had visual input, it would take over auditory regions. And, if you're born blind, if you had auditory input, it would take over visual regions, and vice versa. If you were born deaf before hearing aids and you had visual stimulus, vice versa. So she would show that these large swaths of cortex were plastic in terms of modalities, depending on the input and your basic, whether you had problems with hearing or vision. And then finally, and I was so lucky, Bob Galambos was like the Uber guy. He would go to all the lab meetings. He was retired, but some of his discoveries, he discovered bat echolation. Think about that for a minute. And, he had figured out that the bats were squeaking at 20 kilohertz, and he let bats loose in his lab with wires hanging in a infrared camera. Put in 20 kilohertz, they flew into the wires. Brilliant. Then for those of you who are parents, your kids have probably had the brainstem auditory lobe potential. He discovered it in cats in 1967. He sent it to the journal. The journal said it's a speaker artifact. He said, no, it's not. So he took a tube and ran it down the hole 50 or 60 feet, ran the sound into the hollow ear bars in the cat, and showed the latency changed by the conduction time. And now they published it. And now probably in 40 states, your kid has to get a brainstem to make sure they when they're born, to make sure they don't have a hearing loss. He proposed an active role of glia in neural processing in 1980. Everybody laughed at him. Guess what? He was right. There's papers, there's journals now, glial neural interaction. I think he's a real example of persistence. People were telling him he was wrong multiple times, and I guess maybe because he was a tough Hungarian, he just said, I don't care, I'm moving on. So, couple points from mentoring for people in this audience. To me, key points, it's best if trainees can pursue their own research. It's nice to have an environment where the trainees in your lab support and help each other. As the PI, you should be available. You should really support novel ideas and clear experiments, and let the data decide what's real. I found that nothing beats a happy lab environment, and think about how your research can make a difference in understanding brain function in both health and disease. That's my general Uber feeling. So now about the academia. How tough is academia? Well, I was so excited, took my first faculty job at UC Davis in 1980, put together my first R01, right? And I sent it off in 1981, and you wait then for your pink sheets. People don't, maybe some people on this call knows what they are. It used to be you didn't go online and look at what your priority score was. You got an envelope with your reviews uh, uh, basically printed on pink paper. God knows why they chose pink, maybe to make people feel better if they got rejected. I don't know. In any event, here's my first pink sheets. NIH grant submission, attention orientation, human prefrontal cortex was brain lesions and electrophysiology. Direct quotes from the grant. The proposal is well designed and the preliminary data support the feasibility of the proposed experiments. However, since we are no longer performing frontal lobotomies, I still want to kill this person if I could figure out who it was. The relevance of the proposed research to the NIH mission is not apparent. Unbelievable, right? Now, you can't read something about psychiatric disease or neurological disease, not all neurological, most psychiatric, that's not linked to something off in frontal lobe interaction with the rest of the brain. I didn't know what to do. How do you respond to a review where they just say, your research is not relevant? So again, mentoring. I reached out to, I called the home office and said, how should I respond to the review? Here's their advice to me. if you were my kid brother, I'd tell you to switch to molecular biology." And I said, "Well, I don't want to do molecular biology. I wanna do neuroscience. I wanna understand how the human brain functions." So I was kinda like at a it was a bad scene. But I went back to deciding who could help. And I thought of Kenny Heilemann, and now probably most of you don't know Kenny. This is him when he was 87. This would have been 40 years ago. He's a very prominent behavioral neurologist, one of the founders of the field, and an expert in a syndrome that I really was fascinated by, hemispatial neglect, where half the world doesn't exist, but input into that area still can influence your behavior, although you didn't consciously perceive it. It's an amazing syndrome. In any event, I cold called Kenny. He didn't know me from Adam. I had just started. I just was submitting, initial papers from my postdocs. I might have had one publication, maybe two. And I asked him what I should do. And Kenny was from New York, and of course, in his New York accent, he said, "Don't worry. They always make mistakes back there. Just switch it to a different study section." I said, "Oh, you can do that?" He said, "Yeah, do it." And there were only two study sections then, neurology A and neurology B. I was in B. They switched it to A, and lo and behold, thank God, I got funding. And that started my research career. So I'm so, appreciative of these mentors. I will say that somehow the grant is still active. It's in its 41st year of funding, so it'll probably go. I have 2 more years, and I think that probably will be the end of the road of that R01. But thank you to all my mentors. Okay, now before I get into more details about Frontiers for Young Minds, and I was specifically told, don't talk about science. But I will just a bit. I won't show you any science. The early stages of my career were focused on taking advantage of the classic neuropsychological subjects, patients with lateral frontal damage or orbital frontal damage or hippocampal infarcts, and studying them combined with scalp electrophysiology, because that's all we really had at that time. FMRI was just beginning to be thought about sort of in the mid and late 80s. And we got a lot done. We had a lot of nice work. We still do lesion work, but in 2002, we had a sea change in the sense that we were able to start recording intracranial activity in patients being evaluated for refractory epilepsy. And you might say, "Gee, how big is that population?" Well, the incidence of epilepsy in this country, and interestingly, pretty much around the world, is roughly 1%. So you think about it, that's like 3.5 million people who have epilepsy, and I'm sure many people on this Zoom know somebody, either a family member or even personally, or a friend, or who has epilepsy. So 1%. Now, mercifully, about 75% can be controlled with medications. But that leaves still a lot of people. When you think there's 3.5 million, you got another 500,000 or so who are medication refractory. And if you can localize the seizure onset zone, you can go in and surgically remove it. In fact, as we speak, we're recording from a case in San Francisco today, two of the postdocs in the lab. And this gives you unprecedented access, really, to the spatial temporal dynamics of human cognition. Initially, most of the cases had big grid electrodes, uh, and that has morphed in the last 10 years to basically more stereo, where we have targeted electrodes into the amygdala and the OFC and lateral frontal and insula and hippocampus, and so on. And the patients are in the hospital for anywhere from 7 to 10 days. And if they feel like it, which most people are a little bit smarter than the politicians, they know that research is valuable. They agree to participate. We can do various studies, attention, memory, language, and we've done many areas. In 2009, a young neurosurgical resident joined my lab, Eddie Chang, for a year. They have to do a year of research as part of their program. Most of the top neurosurgical programs that want to, produce academic neurosurgeons, they want them to be, do research. So we were doing what we had discovered in around 2003 or 4 is that there was a very nice signal in the human cortex called high frequency activity, The bandpass is 70 to 150 to 200 hertz. You can't really pick it up in the scalp because it's only about 10 microvolts on the surface of the brain, and it's just lost in noise, in scalp recordings, but it's very reliable at the single trial level, and we were using it for attention and, memory studies, etcetera. Eddie wanted to do language, so we switched to language, and we did a couple, we did more than a couple. We did some nice experiments where we were able to actually use direct brain recording to decode words that people heard and play them back from the brain. It's kind of like taking each electrode as a piano key and ascribing to it a different frequency at a different time. We also then were able to record people's imagining of words, and this was very exciting. Eddie then subsequently, after his postdoc, he went off to UCSF as an assistant professor, and he's had a fantastic career really focusing on using intracranial recording for translational use to basically not only understand language, but provide assistive devices, and lo and behold, he's now chair of neurosurgery. So anyway, we do a lot of that recording, and I'm just gonna show you something that I thought was a little funny for me because 'cause I'm from New Jersey, and New Jersey, kind of where I grew up, we kinda didn't believe in the Queen's English, basically. We were kinda it's a little bit different. So they asked me to give a talk on language in the brain in the Society for the Neurobiology of Language, and I said, "You really want me to give this talk?" They said, "Yeah, for sure." So to start the talk off, here's how I started the talk. I'm not gonna do anything about the data. It was all about this decoding of language. So on the right is Nina Dronkers, a really very, renowned, aphasia expert. She was then president of the Society for the Neurobiology of Language. And on the left is my wife, Donatella, who actually ran our patient recruiting for our lesion for many years. So I started with this at the talk. These are things they told me that I say incorrectly. I'm not sure they're incorrect. They're pretty sure. Number 5, it was very less possible. Number 2, I'm doing good. When I hear somebody say I'm doing well, I cringe. It doesn't seem right to me. To who? They say it's supposed to be to whom. Is that correct? I don't know. I should have went to the meeting. I mean, that's what you say in New Jersey. And then finally, how you doing? I'm from Jersey. So basically, the talk went very well, but starting the talk off with something that just often makes things a little bit smoother. All right, so I've kind of hopefully not wasted your time, but shown you how serendipity and different people in your career really influence where you're going to end up in life. I've pointed out that I think being persistent is really important because roadblocks get thrown at you constantly. Um, in any event, let's move on to the main topic, which is really the kids' journal. So let's start at the beginning. In 2009, I was at a Society for Neuroscience pre-meeting held by Nature. They had invited about 15 uh, neuroscientists in different fields to discuss where they thought their fields were going so Nature could be on the lookout for potentially hot topics. And I'm not exactly sure what happened, but by about 10 that morning, I just got fed up with adults interacting. And I basically said, "How about we put kids in charge of some of this? Let them decide what should be published. Maybe they could be the reviewers of papers." And interestingly, the other scientists that were there said, "Hey, that's a good idea. That's a pretty good idea." So, we talked to Nature. They had Nature people there, and they, I guess, talked to the Home Office, and they said, "Hey, that's a pretty interesting idea, but we have to figure out how to monetize it." Okay, that was the key word, monetize it. I said, "You whoa, monetize it means well-to-do kids have access, other kids don't have access. It has to be free. It has to be open source." And they just didn't really wanna hear that. So, the idea stayed in my mind, uh, but I wasn't quite sure how to pursue it. And luckily, actually, when I went back to Berkeley after that meeting and they told me to monetize it, I basically bought a bunch of domain names. I had Nature Teenager, Nature High School, Nature Junior High, Nature Kids. I bought a ton of them just to kind of block them doing it and monetizing it. They never did, so it wasn't a big deal. Um, okay, so there we were, and then out of the blue, this new upstart journal series, the Frontier series, which now has grown into a monster with over 100 different subfield articles. They approached me about being the uh, first chief editor of a journal called Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, which I'm s- I'm suspecting some of you may have actually published in. And I really didn't want to be the editor of an adult journal. I'd been on boards. I just didn't appeal to me. But I made a deal with them. I said, "Look, if you, um, if I take over and start this Frontiers for Human Neuroscience, when and if your journal gets stable, I want you to agree to support a kids journal." And they agreed. And lo and behold, 3 or 4 years later, 2012, 2013, they ap they said, "Look, we're ready to go with your idea about a kids journal." And I said, "Absolutely, fantastic." And I said, "You don't have to do it because I have other potential resources." Of course, I didn't. That was just playing poker with them, but they were great. Frontiers was absolutely fabulous, and they basically gave us the funding and the support to do the journal. We also didn't want to use the Frontiers format, which was a bit cold. We wanted something that was more appealing to kids. And I thought one thing should be a cartoons associated with each article, which we've done to this day. And it's really, I think the cartoonists over the years have been fabulous in trying to capture the essence of the article. Okay, so how do you start a journal? Well, here's how I started it. I contacted 50 people I knew in neuroscience, most of whom who had kids, and asked them if they'd join this idea about having a journal where kids were in charge of reviewing articles, and young kids. We didn't want it to be a high school gig because there are a lot of high school stuff and high school science clubs and various things like that. And lo and behold, amazingly, 40 people, roughly 40 out of 50 people said, "Hey, we'll join your editorial board." That told me that the research scientific community was interested because, if you ask people to join an editorial board for a journal that's going to cure cancer, you might get a 10 or 20% yes rate. So this was amazing. So I had all these editors. Now what do you do with them? Well, of course, what I had planned, if I could get editors who had kids, I said, okay, now that you're editors, we have to launch the journal and you have to submit the first article. So it was a little bit of a kind of semi, I guess, bait and switch, but they were great about it, and they submitted a bunch of articles, and the journal at that time was running out of my living room, so I get the article and find a kid reviewer and hook them up with a grad student or a postdoc, and it worked. It was really it was fun. Frontiers realized that it was a good thing. They were getting a lot of kudos for it in terms of them trying to build brand name for their journal. Here's this kids journal that it seems to be um, really getting traction, and so the it just kept growing. We got some funding, more funding from Frontiers. It allowed us to expand the staff, and I'll go into that in a bit. And now let's just go into how the journal really works. What's the essence of Frontiers for Young Minds? The simplest thing is that we want kids to understand the scientific method. At the core of everything we do. And what's the best way to do that? We decided it was making them reviewers of papers that are submitted by scientists targeting kids 8 to 12 or 12 to 14 or maybe even 15. Um, and basically that was the idea, that we would give them agency, and they would have to understand what the scientific method was. Now, how does that accomplished? Okay, I'll talk about this a little bit later. The journal as you'll see, has really exploded in global use. Way back when, in 2013, I had an initial idea if we could get Nobel Prize winners engaged and submit articles targeted for kids, that would be, you know, if not, first it would be great science. Second, it would be great marketing, and I'll show you that has actually been successful. We also really feel that the best thing we could do is make this available in many different languages because not every kid in every part of the world actually speaks English. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So that was one of the early ideas. So here, our initial supporter was the Jakob Foundation. They really helped us get off the ground. We've had some other really amazing philanthropists, and we're constantly looking for new sources of funding so we can continue to expand the journal. So, what's the flow like? Scientists write an article for 8 to 15-year-olds. When the article gets sent to the home office in Switzerland, we initially do a screen to make sure it's appropriate for a kid's journal. Most articles, there's some that are just odd and they shouldn't really be sent out to kids for review. Most of them are good, but a lot of them are the reading level is off. So we do a readability analysis. And if the article is really coming in like for a junior or a senior in high school, we'll just go back to the people, to the authors and ask them to please redo the article and pay attention to the language in terms of the content. Now, to be clear, we don't want this to be a dumbed down article. We want it to we want it to really convey the core of the information. And in fact, if it's understandable by a 12-year-old, it's probably nicely understandable by the population. So it's a tremendous, I think, source of knowledge. So that's the idea there. There's 2 kinds of articles. It could be a new discovery, and I'll show you many different topics, or it could be a core concept. Let's say someone has done a lot of work in color vision and they want to review their work. So it could be kind of a review article or a new discovery article. We'll take both kinds. Now, again, the article is reviewed by a science mentor. The science mentor could be a grad student, a postdoc, or a scientist. It has to be someone PhD in training or above level, and they are hooked up with a kid or a group of kids or a classroom. In fact, during COVID, we basically did tons of reviews the mentor and kids were being done by Zoom. That still happens a lot, but if a lot of it can be also local. We want the researchers who do the review to have some experience in peer review. They've published an article or has been co-authors on articles. We want a constructive review from the kids, and we want the kids to get a feel for what's it like to be a scientist, and what's the process, and critically, what's the scientific method. Now, every article gets a cartoon. As you can see, just looking at these articles, you could probably guess what these articles were about. Obviously, the top one on the left is about using stem cells in medicine. The one on the right is about traumatic brain injury. We actually did a full collection of 10 articles for kids on what's a TBI and how do you get it, how do you image it, how do you recover. And you can obviously see the bottom one is an article focused on extracting of uh, hydrocarbons from the air. So there's a whole wide range of articles. In fact, we have 8 scientific areas now. As you might guess, it started with neuroscience, and then we expanded it to neuroscience and psychology, and we've added all these different areas. You can see astronomy and physics, engineering, chemistry, human health, math and economics, biodiversity, earth sciences, and they each section has their own chief editor, 1 or 2, 1 or sometimes 2 editors. Then we have a lot of associate editors who handle the review process with the mentor, again, grad student, postdoc, etc., and the kids, and it works really nicely. The We just did a little kind of a survey with the kids about what would they like to see next. One of the ones that they wanted was technology robotics, and they wanted robotics, and that led to us opening up this one with engineering, technology, and AI. The next one that they've suggested they would like is a complete 180. It's paleontology. So we'll see. We're not quite ready to do that yet, but maybe we will be. Now, I should say, um, we can't, because of the funding limits of the journal, we'd like to be able to review and get a review and publish most, if not all, of the submissions because they're all being done by people who care about kids, right? I mean, they're being very often the first author is a grad student, um, but we can't do that for all the articles. We have to be if we have, let's say we've got a couple articles on asthma, or a couple articles on this, or carbon extraction or fisheries or whatever. We really we really don't want, we can't handle getting another article in that area. So if you're thinking of submitting, you probably want to at least see if there's a clone of your article somewhere, because if there is, we're probably not going to be able to review it. Not because it's not a good article, not because we wouldn't want to, but because we just don't have the resources to review every single article. So here's the flow. Invited scientists rewrite key articles. They don't have to be invited. They can actually be spontaneous. We've gone to collections where we'll have a leader on the collection. We had one on adolescent psychiatry, and they put together 10 articles from people on adolescent psychiatry. As I mentioned, we do readability. We have get a science mentor. The young reviewers comment on the manuscript. They have to comment on each aspect. They have to comment on what's the hypothesis, what's the do they understand the experimental design? Do they understand the results? And do they understand the formulation of the conclusion? So it's really the scientific method done in peer review. We want the kids to think critically, and we hope we're engendering kids who really be the scientists of tomorrow. I should have provided an example, but if you go to the journal, each kid reviewer is basically has their own. There's a link to them. We don't show their last name, and they do an avatar. We don't show their picture, but then they have a little thing they can say what their interests are, and it's cute to read what the interests are of these kids. They're all over the place, from horseback riding to climbing to you pick it. It's fun to see what the kids what is meaningful what is meaningful to the kids. And I think what is meaningful to me are three things. It's for those of you who bet, I don't, but those of you who like horse betting, the trifecta, you get all three correct. Well, there's three things that are correct in this journal. One, most important, the kids are empowered. Their opinion counts. When they write the review, when they write the review, interacting with the mentor, who then translates the kids' opinions into text to put into blocks of what's the scientific method, et cetera. When that review, goes out, they're empowered. They feel like people pay attention. They're paying attention to their opinion, and that alone is worth having, I think. That alone, I think, is worth having this journal. Number two, the mentors are fulfilling their desire to have public outreach. It's natural public outreach. And if I write a letter of recommendation, let's say for a grad student, for a postdoc, or a postdoc for a job or whatever, and they've reviewed and mentored for Frontiers for Young Minds, I always put in a section on what they've done in terms of public outreach. So it's a winner there. And then the other big winner is the authors, because, for the first time in their life, they have to have something that a human being can understand. And I say that, somewhat jokingly, but as you all know, scientific articles by definition are heavy on technology and methodology, et cetera. It's not that we don't have them in the kids' journal, but you wanna make it accessible so the kids understand it. I will say what's one of the biggest review criticisms of the kids, they find that the figures are not clear. They're not really, explaining, they don't get the figures. So we end up having a lot of the papers we ask the scientists to revise their figures. I will say this, we've now published 1,800 articles, and out of those 1,800 articles, of the authors, when they got the reviews, none of them complained, and they did whatever the kids wanted. Can you imagine that in in the regular world where you're going, "Well, point 3 from reviewer 3, I'm not quite sure we wanna do that." The kids, they just do it, and they do it, I think, because they know this is what the kids want. So, in that sense, it's a trifecta win. Okay, what about the global impact? Well, here's where we are now in terms of I just got new numbers this morning. We're now up to 60 million article views and downloads. The average view per article is 33,000. That's a lot. If you look at um, the Frontiers journal series. The Frontiers for Young Minds is the number 2 most viewed and downloaded article of every journal that they have. So people really go to it, and it's not just kids. A lot of kids use it from around the world, but actually we can see people in even adults using it. So it's a good source. We're active in 230 countries and territories. We started with English. We got a donor, and the whole journal's in Hebrew. So if you go to the journal and you click on the right, the whole journal will turn into Hebrew. Since we had it in Hebrew, I think Saudi Arabia said, "Whoa, we can't have that." So Saudi Arabia then funded an Arabic version. We don't have major funding for French or Chinese, but we have had volunteers translate about 100 articles. So we're still looking for major donors, but we do have articles in French and Chinese. We're also actively looking for a supporter to take the journal into Hindi, and into Spanish, which would be absolutely, fantastic. It's if by the way, if anybody out there knows a big philanthropist who wants to be, that uh, would be like to be involved in this kid's journal, let me know, but first direct them to Connect, and then, well, I don't wanna co-opt any of your philanthropists. So it's really exploded, in interest globally. Now with many awards and yada, yada, yada. It was presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The climate change got lots of kudos. It just keeps getting awards for science education. And that's really because of the tremendous team in Switzerland who they run this thing like a top. I mean, really, I don't have to do hardly anything now except continue to try to find more external support, for the journal. I'll go over them right at the end, the team and how we make this work. Now, media awards, we've been in the Post, the London Times, and various awards. I had an interesting interaction with the London Times. They did a really nice article on the Kid Journal. It was a good article, and then they asked me to be interviewed by their radio blog, whatever they call it, site. I said, "Sure." It was an interesting conversation because the interviewer, the first thing they said was, "Well, Professor Knight, can you tell us how AI is going to, help kids be smarter?" And I said, "Okay, stop." I don't think that's what AI's purpose is. It's a powerful tool, but AI is not going to teach kids to be creative. And we went back and forth. You wanted me to say AI will fix everything. I'd say no, creativity, letting kids' minds float around and come up with new ideas and pursue new things. That's what you want. It was interesting. The bottom line is he cut the interview short. So I'm not sure that was good or bad, but that's the way the world goes now. So, what about the Nobel collection? We now have, well, there's 34. We have 34 Nobel Prize winners whose articles have been submitted. We do a little bit different. The Nobel Prize, they're pretty busy. Everybody wants them. So, what we've done is set up where they get interviewed. We have a science writer who interviews them for a few hours, writes a draft of an article, then we send it to them, and then they edit it and change it and put in whatever figures they want. It's been very successful. You can see we have Nobel Prize winners in chemistry and medicine, physiology, Danny Kahneman, economics, and so on. Most recently, Jennifer Doudna just did a fantastic article on CRISPR. I hate to say it, she's 2 buildings away at Berkeley, and I thought I understood CRISPR, but I didn't really understand it until I read her kid version because I didn't quite have down the double mRNA part of it. But in any event, it's a great resource. You can see when the articles had over 300 million social media hits, 2.5 views and downloads, 2.5 million. So, and we're very active. We're now in discussions with another 7 or 8 Nobel Prize winners. Hopefully, we'll get it up to 40 by the end of the year. Some of Berkeley, Jennifer's Berkeley, and Randy Sheckman is Berkeley, and Eric's Berkeley. We should be able to pick up 2 more from Berkeley this year because Berkeley got a Nobel in physics and another one in chemistry this year. So it's on my agenda to contact them and bug them. All right, so we're getting close. The laureates love it. Now, here's Maybert Mosher. She did grid cells. with Edward Mosher, fantastic. Interestingly, they both started as clinical psychologists and then learned neuroscience, and she loved the journal. Here's a quote from her: "I hope the papers in this journal nurture and reinforce children's passion for science. What a gift to humanity that would be." Michael Levitt, chemistry, happier about this than almost anything I've ever done. Bert Sagman wrote that he had when his grandkids who were 10 and 11 or 12 read his article, he basically said, "Grandpa, this is the first time we understand what you actually do for work." He was quite pleased. Uh, what are the benefits? I think I don't need to sell this crowd on what are the benefits. Um, it's good for enabling kids to be engaged with science. You can see all the various things it can do, and I think it's good for your soul to publish. I think our big roadblock right now is STEM education. We believe these articles are state of the art new STEM. They're not STEM from 10 years ago in a textbook, but it's very hard to crack that code because the teachers want a lesson plan, right? They want a lesson plan, and because they're required to have it because of these common core curriculums, particularly in the public schools. So we're working on that. We have an active program that if a classroom reviews an article, the teacher also gets a lesson plan. So hopefully we'll crack that, and we would be very happy in the next 5 years if we've had more schools basically using Frontiers for Young Minds as their go-to STEM source of information. Okay, so we're really at the end of this. I saved some time. People can, ask, whatever questions you want. I'm the, field chief editor and founding editor, but Idan Segev is my co-chief editor. Idan is the head of neurobiology at Hebrew University. He's a fantastic person. And you say, how did he get involved in the journal? Early on, he submitted an article to the kids' journal called the Big Blue Brain Project, a very dense computational one. I probably should have sent it back to him and told him to fix it, but I didn't. I sent it to an 11-year-old reviewer who actually was in Israel, randomly. And before I got her review, I got an email from her dad, who turns out was an assistant professor in Eton's unit. And the dad said, "My daughter's about to send her review in. I want you to know I had nothing to do with it." So we got the review, and she said she couldn't understand anything. And it was really a complicated computational article. Now, I sent these reviews back to Idan. You'd think, that, he's a pretty prominent guy. I'd go, "Well, kids, what do they know?" No, he revised the article. I sent it back to the kid. Amy said, "It's better. It's still hard to get through the first paragraph." Sent it back to him again, revised it again. She accepted it. And he then called me and said, "This journal's real. What can I do?" I said, "Okay, you're co-chief editor." So that's how that basically evolved. We have a fantastic head of the program, Laura Henderson, who lives and breathes this. You can see we've expanded from one person to a bunch. We have specialists in different areas. There's a specialist in Hebrew, someone in Arabic. Uh, Interestingly, a woman from Rome is the specialist in English. She probably knows English better than a kid from rural New Jersey would be, my guess, and so on. So we really try to have a nice supporting infrastructure, and we have it. They are the key. These people that were you can see the Ning is she's doing Chinese. We'd love if I showed you this in a few years, we'd have Hindi and Spanish, etcetera. We don't now. All right, so I'll conclude with a few of my favorite quotes from kids that you would never get in an adult review. It would be helpful if they told us how they took the measurements of brains without actually having to remove the brain. That's an appropriate question from a 9-year-old. Here's another one. The writers of the article did not make it clear why such an expensive and involved research project was done to begin with. It seemed like a fruitless task. Ouch. Can you imagine if you got that in a review? It was like my initial NIH review. Painful. Here's another good one. The point is not clearly expressed. I didn't understand the main scientific question because there were so many details at the beginning. Maybe state what the main question is earlier in the manuscript. Pretty good advice, from a 10-year-old. really, really good advice. And then finally, this seems important, but the way it is written is so boring, I can't even get to the end. Maybe the authors could maybe sound excited about what they're doing. So the kids are pretty direct in some of their inputs. And as I said, the authors basically just deal with it and revise the paper accordingly. So I hope you got a little bit of a feel about how I got to be an academic and how that being an academic allowed me to actually have the connections to get this journal going, which we're all very proud of because we know kids really like it. We do live reviews, as Manuela mentioned, uh, and they're very nice because the parents are often there. Maybe 3 scientists will present their papers, like, in a TED format for maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, and then a panel of kids will review them live, and then they'll have a little get together in conference. Is this a reject? It usually never is. Is it a revise, an accept, or is it a full acceptance? So there's a whole bunch of fun things we can do.